Scripture reading today comes from the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. Faith is the reality of what we hope for, the proof of what we don't see. The elders of the past were approved because they showed faith. By faith, we understand that the universe has been created by a word from God, so that the visible came into existence from the invisible.
This summer, I forgot to get my microphone. I got so caught up in the VBS program, but I just forgot it. So I might be a little stationary. Well, we're in the midst of a series that's focused on several questions, asked, faith questions in a skeptical age. And we've already dealt with, okay, we believe in, is there just one true religion? We've also talked about whether you believe in science and creation at the same time. Next week, we're going to talk about the problem of suffering and evil. Today, we're focused on the questions, how do you believe in a God that you cannot prove? So how many of you have a friend or a co-worker or somebody you know that's either an avowed atheist or there's someone that is agnostic to the point that they bug you about? So, those can be tough conversations, kids. And probably the ideal way to have this message today would be to get a Christian apologist comes in who's versed in quantum physics and science and logic and philosophy, and get them on one side and let an atheist on the other side, just let them go at it. And then see where it comes down to. But my guess is if we did that, we would probably experience that a lot like a debate between a Democrat and a Republican. We'd end up hearing what we want to hear, and there'd be still a lot of debate about who actually won that debate. I think this question is kind of the same kind of way. And it's really become true that it's even more challenging question because of people like Richard Dawkins, who's written the book God Delusion, and Stephen Hawking, who's a scientist who has come to the conclusion that he believes science does not support the idea of a God. And so it's become trendy to say that the more that you know, that knowledge will bring less of a need for religion. Matter of fact, I've even heard people say I'm too smart to go to church. So what I hope to do today is to help give you some things that you might say to your atheist friend. Something might help you have an intelligent conversation with them, but also to hear where they're coming from, because you're going to find there's a counter debate on just about everything that a Christian might put forth. Because I believe that we have to respect people before you can love them. And I think the only way you're ever going to win someone into the faith is through love and not through argument. So let's deal with a few of the big questions that your atheist friends might bring up. And the first one would be, especially if you read the book by Richard Dawkins, you would discover that he spends a lot of time talking about the failures of people of faith. Especially he begins talking about the Muslim faith, how much terrorism has become a part of our world. And he challenges that most of those issues come about because of religious views. He'll also point out in the Christian history, we have several examples where religious groups have fought against one another. It happened in early America that many people fled Europe because of their religious beliefs. Ireland had the Protestants against the Catholics, and even in the Middle East, you have the Shiites versus the Sunnis. They fight against one another. And he comes to the conclusion that the world would just be a safer place if we could eliminate religion altogether. Well, I'd like to counter some of those thoughts. First of all, if you just look at the Muslim faith itself, how many Muslims are in the world? 1.6 billion. 1.6 billion. Some have done research to say that really you can only tie down that those that are really fervent in their faith to the point that they acted out in violent ways in the Muslim faith, it comes to about 106,000. Now, some might think that's a small number, but even if you allow for some of that, That number alone comes out to about 0.006625% of all Muslims in the world. So it's important to balance that out and understand that there's a lot of very faithful, peaceful Muslims in this world. Don't let that be skewed. Matter of fact, how many times have you seen in the news maybe a Christian group, a church like, what was that, Westport Baptist Church in Florida, had some crazy, nutty demonstrations. And you look at those and you just say, that's not us, that's not our faith, that doesn't represent us well. And I think we could say the same even for the Muslim faith. So I would say to Richard Dawkins, let's balance that out a little bit. And I would challenge him and say, now let's think about all the good things that people of faith have done in this world. The earliest Christians, part of the reason the Christian faith grew so rapidly after Jesus was because of the compassion that they showed that was so different from the Roman Empire that they saw. Christians gained a reputation because many people in that Roman world, they valued males over females to the point that if there's a female baby born, they'd often just take them out to the hills and leave them to die due to exposure. But it was the Christians who went out and collected these babies and raised them and adopted them. You can go to England and look at John Wesley's movement. England was a terrible place in the early industrial era in the 1700s. And Wesley's movement brought a humanity, compassion to the world. I've read reports that in London alone, alcoholism was so bad that 1 in 9 houses was a tavern in London. And it was the spiritual disciplines that Wesley brought that tamed that culture, that brought peace and health. People that were trying to cope with that industrial age and come from the countryside in need of work, they would send out microloans and help people get started. So many things that were valuable. You come to America and look at how many of the earliest hospitals and schools and orphanages were started by Christians. So I would challenge Richard Dawkins that yes, certainly there is some history that we worry about. Matter of fact, I would concede to Dawkins that some of that history is very valid. This is the 2-volume history of Christianity that I had to read in seminary. And quite honestly, when you read about some of the things that people have done in the name of God, I almost lost my faith reading these 2 books. The one thing that saved me, though, after reading about the Inquisition, about some of the power of the Pope in some years, reading about the Crusades and how silly it was to think that you could somehow win people through war. The one thing I noticed in reading these 2 volumes was that whenever the church got off track, God would bring a movement along. Often it was a lay movement to bring the church back to its center. So I would counter all that Dawkins says. You cannot prove that God does not exist just because of the unfaithfulness of God's followers. The second thing that you'll notice if you read much about atheism, as a matter of fact, if you do a Google search for atheist websites, you'll get 445,000 hits. 445,000 hits. And most of those will turn right to our Bible. And they'll look at the examples of some very obscure passages that often center in the Levitical law, which have some strange laws in them. And they're laws written for a time in which ancient people had different understanding of God and the world. Some of them were very fitting for their time, and some of them were probably just mere superstition. They'll also point out things like God calling Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. Or they'll point out the confusion between Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, and they'll talk about the contradictions that happen just within one short chapter. But to Richard Dawkins, I would want to say, no, wait a minute. You're approaching the Bible like a kindergarten does. Christians who are thinking Christians don't take every word literally. They understand that there's a different work going on here, that many of the Old Testament stories are archetype stories. Even the writers themselves weren't intending people to take it exactly literally. There's a truth found in them when you allow them to be what they're meant to be. The story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, scholars now are ended up in the Bible to show that Judaism was going to be counter to many of the pagan cults at that time who would often have and participate in human sacrifice. So the story helps make the point that our God, Yahweh, would never allow that. So I would challenge Dawkins that the Scriptures, when you take them as they're meant to be taken, when you bring a sophistication that hopefully most Christians bring to it, bring a whole different message to us, and certainly it's not deserving. And then the third thing I want to bring up, and I think it's so important that when you listen to your atheist friends, that you hear them out, that you listen well, and point out to them that the God that they might be describing is not the God you believe in either. And you might find some common ground. And if you listen to them well and with respect, they just might listen to you as you want to share your faith story at some point. But the third thing I want to mention is that often atheists will point to what we call the God of the gaps. They point out that how sometimes religion has been more superstition, how sometimes religion has slowed down the scientific process. Because whenever there's a mystery comes along, Christians want to just give God the credit. And they point out, look how damaging that's been when you had times in which you had plagues and you had illnesses, and how often that people would blame these on God, and they would look for somebody practicing sorcery. Sometimes they would have people put to death to try to find a scapegoat to explain that illness. And that debate even continues today. One of the things, if you read Christian scientists, is they'll talk about the finely tuned universe. The slide shows a few examples. I don't know how much you've looked into this, but it's pretty amazing that life actually exists on planet Earth. Scientists know that our distance from the sun, that Earth is 92.96 billion miles away from the sun, is almost the perfect distance away from the sun so that the Earth doesn't scorch and the Earth doesn't get too cold. If it was 91 million miles, life wouldn't exist on planet Earth. If it was 93.5 million miles away, life would not exist on planet Earth. They point out that the atmosphere is 21% oxygen, just the perfect level for human beings to breathe and operate, for life to exist. If it was 20%, life would not exist on planet Earth. If it was 22%, life would not exist on planet Earth. Even the tilt of the Earth is just so perfect to allow for the cooling and heating of Earth to occur. And they point out that that tilt has happened because of a couple of gravitational pulls, one of which is the moon, which scientists tell us is a meteor that just happened to fall into our orbit, it got caught, and now that gravitational pull tilts the Earth just the right amount to allow life to exist. And so, life exists on planet Earth because of all these finely tuned dials. They say there's over 100 of these kind of dials, conditions that have to take place for life to exist on planet Earth. And we as Christians, we look at these and we say, well, that's a sign of God's hand at work. But if you're an atheist, they'll come at it again from that opposite viewpoint. And they'll tell us that, well, we know through natural selection. We also know that the Earth, that the universe is expanding and continues to expand, and that this kind of blast has happened many times in history. And it just makes sense that eventually one of these planets would get it right. So that's why. That is their explanation for why there's life on planet Earth. So again, there's that stalemate. And there will always be that stalemate. The question is always, God or no God? Are you going to believe in a spiritual realm or not? And that debate will go on and on. But if you get yourselves in that kind of discussion, I give you one gift that you can always say to your scientific friends. And that is that one thing that science continues to point to is a finite beginning. Science so far has never been able to figure out how something can come out of nothing. And for us as Christians, we call that God. And so it's not anti-intellectual to be a theist, to believe that God is here and explains all of creation. But you'll never be able to prove it to someone who comes from that perspective. That's why our Scripture is so valuable. Faith is the reality of what we hope for, the proof of what we don't see. And that's probably how God wants it. If proof was that easy, then it wouldn't be that hard to believe in God. It wouldn't be that hard to trust in Him. And that's the relationship He wants to have with us. So that's the dilemma we find ourselves in. And here's what it comes down to for me. I've shared before how I had a very difficult home life. I had a mother with a mental illness. Sometimes my dad would come home from work as an air traffic controller, stressed from trying to keep airplanes apart. And he'd come home and Mom has been in that nervous state of walking the floors all day. And so he tries to talk her out of that paranoia. And it was frustrating because it couldn't be done. And I remember I'd be on my end of the house in my bedroom, and I'd hear Dad yelling at Mom. He never hit her, but his frustration was so intense. And it was hard to listen to that. And it was lonely to be in that spot. My brother was already out of the house, my sister too young to be of much help. We lived out in the country, I had no friends to turn to. And so I really only had one place to turn to when I was a teenager. And that was God. And fortunately, I had a church, I had a youth group, I had a youth minister that had taught me to pray. And it's in those times of loneliness that I turned to God, and because I believed He was there, I found His presence, I found His comfort. And that gave me hope, and that gave me purpose. And I tell you, it came at a time in life that I was at a crossroads, and I don't know where I'd be without God. And so to my atheist friend, I would say, you know, the belief in natural selection would not have done me any good in that time of my life. So even if I can't prove it to you, it's proof enough for me because it's given me what has made my life what it is. And that's what we can always share. And I hope that you get the opportunity to share that kind of thing. To share it out of love. To share it out of love. At the end of the chapter that Martha Jones and Scott Jones share on this book, they have this quote that could be words that might be helpful to you when you have those conversations. Proof about God goes both ways. We can't prove that God doesn't exist just as we can't prove that God does exist. In fact, the only proof we have is that we exist and that we have life and hope. I'm not interested in proving God. I want to live the life that a great and perfect God made possible. Aaron?
Stanley Hauerwas is a theologian at Duke, and he has a quote that I've come across many times, and I think it kind of helps me to remember a few things. But it says this: as soon as you start feeling that you need to defend God, there's a good chance what you're worshiping is an idol. God is big enough to defend God itself. Another person, Will Willem, who was a bishop of the United Methodist Church and also a theologian at Duke, but he once said he doesn't believe in apologetics because apologetics always gives up too much. We can't justify God completely by our intellect. We have to recognize that it does require a faith decision. And just like atheism requires a faith decision, you're having faith that there is no God. That's just as much a faith decision as believing that God exists. And for me, the reason that I know that God exists is that God is love, and it's demonstrated most fully in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, obviously. And what I've found is I've rarely found any real just hardline atheists in the world. People that just don't 100% just say, I don't believe in God no matter what, no matter what, no matter what. Usually most people are people who have become atheists because of their experience, not of Jesus Christ, but because their experience of people who claim the name Christian, who acted in ways or said things that had very, 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 very little to do with Jesus and what he taught and what the church should live out as a beacon of hope and light and love in the world. And if you ever did come across one of those really hardliners that doesn't even want to, you can't even listen to them because they won't even communicate with you, it's just like an attack on you. then I suggest you do as what Jesus did when he sent out his first disciples. And he said, if you come to a town and they do not receive you, knock the dust off your sandals and move on. You know? Sometimes we think that we're the one who saves people. We are not. Jesus is the Savior of the world, not us. And you may not be the person that's going to reach that person. And in fact, you may make it worse. Some of you who have maybe sons or daughters or good friends who you've tried to talk to about the faith and they've just pushed you away and away. Maybe you're not the one that's going to break through. And maybe you need to release them to God and say, God, I trust them to you. And I hope that someone maybe someday can break through with them, but it's not going to be me. At least not now. You know, it's that old, not now, but maybe not never either. You know, not now doesn't mean not ever. It just means maybe you're not going to be the conduit through which God's grace is going to flow and work. And one way that I gather when I talk to people who find out at dinner parties or something that I'm a pastor, because my wife doesn't typically tell them right up front, and I don't typically either, because that means usually all the fun stops. No more good jokes. They put the beer away, they put the wine away. But as people talk, you get hints of what's really going on. And they share stories and say, I just can't believe this or that. You Christians say this and that. And I just can't believe that. I just think that sounds too ridiculous. And I'm like, well, yeah, you may say that, but I don't really think that that's really the central thing you need to believe to be a Christian. That's not really the gist of it. And then they're like, interesting. So then they go on with something else and they point out, well, what about that crazy guy that said this and this horrible event happened and it was all due to this group. This group is to blame. Like that group somehow controls the weather. Flooding, hurricanes, things like that. I mean, come on. Get with the program, people. The crazy people that go out and picket at soldiers' funerals and things. Horrible. That is not a good witness for Jesus Christ. And it is not what I hope that people think of as Christian. But unfortunately, that's just the next thing people bring up is some crazy thing some so-called Christian leader did. And then I said, I wish I didn't have to claim them as part of my tribe either. They're kind of a mess. I agree. I think that's ridiculous. I wish someone would censure them. But unfortunately, free speech has its drawbacks at times. Anyway, and then usually you get to the gist of what it's really about. I remember one Christmas party, and I've told this story before, but I don't know if I told it here or where I told it, but this guy came up to me, he started this usual thing. I didn't know we sat in the corner and just talked for a long time, and then somehow he found out I was a pastor, and then he apologized and hid his beer behind his back and all that stuff. And then he gave me all the usual excuses about why he didn't go to church and that he was an atheist and all these things. And then, after a while, he came back and said, that isn't the Jesus I've ever heard about, the one you're kind of talking about, the church you're talking about. That's not been my experience. And he talks about how in Kentucky his family, by force one Sunday, drug him down the aisle and baptized him. Physically drug him down the aisle and forced him to be baptized. And that was the image that he had of Jesus and the church, was that somehow, whether you wanted to accept God's grace or not, it was going to be forced upon you, even by them. And that was the thing that just he couldn't accept, because that wasn't love to him. And I hope that isn't love for any of you either. Love is always offered as a gracious gift. It's not forced upon you. And it's vulnerable. And because of God's love and His grace, people do come to know Him and realize that He is a living God. And whether you can prove it, with empirical data or not, you know that God exists. When we gather together around a common purpose, when we seek to love one another, when we seek to live in peace with our neighbor, when we seek to be an example of how a mother or a father should treat their children. So you might not be able to prove it, but I think if you listen, most people are not rejecting God, they're rejecting what they see by so-called Christians. So maybe if they saw you living in a way that is truly Christian, then they can be drawn to Him through you. But if not, knock the dust off your feet. Maybe God will use someone else in that person's life to bring about